Check, check, check. Check. Check, check, check. Okay. All right, I think we're going to begin. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the human rights and humanitarian situation in Central America. I want to thank our witnesses for their presence here today, and I want to thank all the work they do on behalf of human rights and dignity of people in Central America. And I will apologize in the beginning. We may be interrupted with some votes, but hopefully it won't take too long, and if that happens, we'll get right back to the hearing. And maybe you might want to close that door just so people can hear better. As some of you may know, Central America is where I got my start working on human rights issues. Before I was elected to Congress in 1996, I had the privilege of serving for 14 years as a senior aide to the late U.S. Congressman Joe Moakley from South Boston. One of the first things Joe did was to send me to El Salvador in the early 1980s to review firsthand the human rights situation based on some reports he had received from Salvadoran refugees in his district. And that's how my long relationship with El Salvador began. In 1989, Joe asked me to help him lead a congressional investigation on behalf of a special commission appointed by the Speaker of the House, who asked Joe to chair the commission into the murders of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter, committed at the University of Central America in San Salvador in November of 1989. The murders took place in the context of the Salvadoran Civil War, and we were able to determine that the Salvadoran military planned them and carried the murders out. The Jesuit murders were a notorious example of the brutal human rights violations that were committed in El Salvador and Guatemala throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. Massacres, forced disappearances, torture, rape, and internal displacement were tactics in the conflicts that ravaged those countries, and they were supposed to stop after the peace agreements were signed and democracy took hold. But as we will hear later today, signing peace agreements and ending armed conflicts did not end human rights abuses, nor did the revolution in Nicaragua, and the 2009 coup in Honduras opened the door to increased abuses. Freedom House has characterized 3 of the 4 countries we are concerned with today as only partly free. Yes, elections are held, but formal democratic institutions are fragile or they're ineffective. People who exercise their freedom of expression and association are oftentimes at risk. Journalists are attacked for doing their job, and human rights defenders are threatened, subjected to legal harassment, or killed, especially those like Berta Caceres, who stand up for indigenous land and environmental rights. We will hear today about the very high levels of violence in the region, violence by gangs and criminal networks, arbitrary or unlawful killings by police and military forces, and widespread sexual and gender-based violence. The most recent State Department country reports on human rights practices for Guatemala cited, and I quote, lethal violence against women, end quote, as a principal type of human rights abuse in that country. El Salvador also suffers from the highest rate of femicide in Latin America. We will hear about pervasive corruption at the highest levels of government that opens the door to the influences of organized crime. And we will hear about the continued marginalization of indigenous people and small farmers, the unending struggle for land rights, persistent impunity, and forced internal displacement. All issues we were talking about 30 years ago when the armed conflicts were raging. I don't want to give the impression that nothing at all has changed or that there's no good news. There is some progress on accountability. Just a few days ago, on October 13th, the criminal trial against former Guatemalan dictator Efrain Rios Montt and his intelligence chief resumed. They are charged with the murder of 1,771 Maya people, the violent displacement of 29,000, and rape and torture committed in connection to 15 documented massacres. In September, the Salvadoran government established a commission to search for the remains of people who were forcibly disappeared during the Civil War. This achievement is due in large part to the efforts of organizations like Our Parents' Bones, whose members are children of the disappeared, including Salvadoran Americans, who hope one day to be able to give their parents a decent burial. And there are other indications of progress: the growing independence of the public ministry in Guatemala and its success alongside CICIG in prosecuting key corruption cases, and the decision of the Salvadoran government to ban all metal mining in order to protect communities' water sources. But in spite of these bright spots, the terrible reality is that last fiscal year, U.S. authorities at the southwestern border apprehended nearly 200,000 unauthorized migrants from the Northern Triangle of Central America. More than half were unaccompanied children or families, and many were seeking humanitarian protection. People are fleeing for their lives, leaving behind their homes and their countries. So something is very wrong, as we in Congress recognized when we funded the new U.S. strategy for engagement in Central America. Implementation has just begun. It is too early to know how it all will work or how well it will work. And achieving lasting results will require time and sustained commitment on all our parts, in region and here in the United States. Today we need to examine the reality on the ground in Central America and remind ourselves why people might take great risks to flee in such large numbers. We need to examine the capacity of the Central American governments to respond to the humanitarian crisis caused by the ongoing violence. What's happening to the hundreds of thousands of people in the region who are being displaced internally? Are the governments complying with their obligations under international law? What will happen if temporary protected status is not renewed in the coming months for Salvadorans, Hondurans, and Nicaraguans? Do these governments have the capacity to absorb tens of thousands more deportees? Are the minimal conditions in place for people to return? If not, would the United States be out of compliance with violating its own obligations under international law? The U.S. has long played an oversized role in Central America. Our histories are intertwined. We need to remember that history. We need to acknowledge it, and we need to make sure that our policies really do contribute to the ongoing process of building an enduring peace and respect for human rights throughout the region. I would just close by saying that one of my frustrations as somebody who has spent a great deal of time, especially in El Salvador, is that the United States seemed only too willing to oblige the government at that time with sending endless amounts of military assistance, training their militaries, providing any kind of assistance to their militaries. And then when the war ended, our commitment to helping rebuild that country, I think, faltered. It was inadequate. And I think part of the reason why we're dealing with some of the issues that I mentioned in my opening statement are because of our failure, not just the United States, but the international community, to help El Salvador implement their peace accord, to make sure that it actually worked. And I hope that's a lesson that we keep in mind as we're thinking about the Colombia peace agreement. Peace agreements are all fine and nice. We all want them. But they don't mean a damn thing if they're not implemented properly, if the resources aren't there to implement them properly. And sometimes what that leads to is more chaos and more violence and more abuses of human rights. And so, anyway, I will end there, but I'm happy now to yield to a member of this commission, the Honorable Congresswoman from Illinois, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky.
Well, I am so happy to be here today for this important hearing, and I don't want to take a lot of time, but I certainly do want to thank our chairman, Mr. McGovern, for his leadership on these issues, particularly when it comes to Central and South America and human rights actually all around the world. I have been I had been and am continued to be supportive of the cause of Berta Caceres and very concerned about her murder, which so far has gone unprosecuted. There was a major story in the New York Times who ordered killing of Honduran activist. Evidence of broad plot is found in Sunday's New York Times. But I've been involved in issues affecting Colombia. Traveled there one time with Mr. McGovern, and also in Honduras as well since the coup, and concerned that sometimes, as policy of the United States of America, because of the counter-narcotics efforts, et cetera, that we end up supporting governments in ways that we should not. I'm very interested in the testimony that's here today, and to understand how we can support efforts of journalists, people who are fighting for indigenous people, people who are fighting for labor rights, who end up being victims in in too many places around the world. And with that, I'll yield back.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your leadership. And I'd like to call our first witness, Chiara Cottoletti Carroll, who is the Deputy Representative of the UN Refugee Agency for the United States and the Caribbean, a position she has held since 2015. Before coming to Washington, she coordinated protection for refugees and IDPs in Sudan. She has worked with the UNHCR field operations in East Timor, Ethiopia, Iran, and Afghanistan, and in the headquarters in the office in Geneva. And Ms. Cottoletti Carroll, we welcome you here, and you may begin your testimony. Just make sure you turn your mic on. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And let me start by thanking you first for your leadership on Central American issues. Of course, the leadership of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for all the work they're doing on these issues. The UN Refugee Agency has and continues to work all around the world to support government in protecting 65 million forcibly displaced persons. And it's a job that we do with the highest of commitments, but with great challenges, given the concurrent number of conflicts that are erupting all throughout the world. And it's, of course, with great dismay that we find ourselves over the past couple of years having to reopen offices that we had otherwise closed in Central America to support governments responding to the influx of refugees resulting from the violence growing in Central America. And we have been working over the past years to do just that, support those governments in strengthening their protection capacity to respond to the violence growing in Central America. And throughout this process, we are very pleased, moderately pleased to say that we have just finished a process last week in Honduras, which was led by the government of Honduras, of bringing together all countries in the region in Central America and further afield, including South America and in Europe, to establish a framework for response for the violence and the displacement from Central America. This resulted in the San Pedro Sula Declaration, which was signed on by 6 countries in the region, including Belize, Costa Rica, Honduras, Panama, and Mexico. And that also was complemented by national plan of actions to try and respond to the violence. This is, of course, a very good step in the right direction, and we welcome it and we applaud it. But it's, of course, just the beginning of a very long process, I fear. Being in Honduras also reminded my colleagues that of the palpable fear that there is in the communities in Honduras. And we were very fortunate to be able to visit some of the projects that were funded by the United States government through the Alliance for Prosperity in one of the neighborhoods, as an example, in San Pedro Sula, Rivera Hernandez, where we actually saw how the funding provided for community policing and for supporting this particular neighborhood actually was bearing results. We saw, for example, situations where the communities felt a lot more comfortable with the police to provide and report crimes. We saw community projects that were able to bring children back to children's life back to normalcy by ensuring that they could go back to school and they could go back to play. And that's a really good step in the right direction. What was, of course, concerning is, but then when we asked the police and the community leaders, what do they do with people that are a threat for their lives and that are reporting to the police to be protected? And they very honestly reported to us that, unfortunately, at this very moment, they only focus on very high-profile cases, but generally speaking, people who have received death threats from the gangs they usually liaise with UNHCR so that they can be evacuated to Costa Rica through this protection transfer arrangement mechanism that we established last year. So, of course, that brings us back to the problem that people are still being persecuted, that people are still having to leave, and that there's, of course, a need to address the problem in country to make sure that we prevent a situation of this occurring, and that we look at root causes and we address the security situation, but that also we have very strong protection mechanism and asylum systems in the region to respond to the needs of people fleeing. And this is something that, of course, is at the forefront of the work that we're doing all throughout the region at the very moment, and it's part of our strategy for engagement in Central America. And this, of course, is something that is happening. We are seeing a lot of positive engagement by the countries. We are seeing a lot of goodwill on the side of countries, including countries such as Mexico, which is very good. But a lot more work needs to be done, and we are continuously working with those governments to make sure that this happens. And of course, the biggest concern is the protection that people receive at the end of this long journey. And we, of course, encourage all government to continue to apply the key instruments, the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, in the most flexible and generous way possible to ensure that people are not returned to countries where their lives may be at risk. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. You you mentioned the violence of gangs and the impact that it has had on not only creating refugees who have fled these various countries. I'm thinking of El Salvador and Honduras in particular, to come to other countries in the region, including the United States. But it's also created this incredible population of internally displaced within the country. People who have had to flee their communities where they have lived all their lives. And one of my concerns is that first of all, the internally displaced, is that there doesn't seem to be the kind of safeguards in place or the protection mechanisms in place, that give me any confidence that those people indeed are safer, even though they have kind of gone from one part of the country to another part of the country. I mean, what? And I know there are some NGOs that are providing, support for protection efforts. But again, this is such a massive problem that I'm just wondering. I mean, how do we deal with that? Clearly, these countries don't have the resources, or not getting the resources to do the kind of internal protection. I'm just curious whether you have any advice or recommendations, specifically with regard to the United States.
I think you are absolutely correct. We have seen for a number of years now a pattern of people displacing internally before they move outside of the country, and ideally they would have found that protection in some of the neighborhoods where they sought that protection. And of course, what we are seeing is that following a number of movement internally, people have to leave and go to neighboring countries to find that protection. So clearly that is a very serious concern. And clearly, until the police and institutions in the countries of origin don't feel that they are capable or able to counteract the action by the gangs, then we are going to have a situation where people are going to be leaving. I do believe that investing in community support and some of the type of projects that we're seeing implemented through the Alliance for Prosperity goes some ways in addressing that problem, in starting to be slowly from the community level up these institutions in a way that we restore the trust between the population and the state, and that there is a sort of a circular mechanism that enables then crimes to be reported and people sort of being protected slowly but surely. But it is going to be challenging, because it means working with the institutions and making sure that they are capable of addressing the insecurity that is currently going on. And it's state building is a long-term process, and it's not something that happens overnight. And we have seen this with many countries around the world. We have been engaged in Afghanistan for many years, and we're still struggling with that. So it is a matter of of slowly investing in these communities, investing in institutions of the state, and making sure that it can provide the security to the population that it needs before when they're facing such threats from such strong actors.
As you mentioned, lots of people have left these countries in Central America to seek refuge in other countries, not just the United States, but a number of countries, and I'm wondering, I don't know what's going to happen with the Dreamers, hundreds of thousands of young people that would be impacted if we were not to extend the protection. Then there's this other thing called temporary protected status, where you've had people living here now, I know the case of El Salvador, for 16 years or so. There's hundreds of thousands of people who fall into that category too. And we're told that there may be decisions on TPS any day now, today maybe even. I mean, could be today, tomorrow, that impacts Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. What would happen if the U.S. decided to not act, to basically terminate those protections? I mean, if all these people were deported to El Salvador and Honduras, I mean, are those countries able to absorb them? What would happen in terms of those countries' ability to try to deal with some of these underlying issues that you talked about, building up communities and trying to deal more effectively with gang violence and dealing with issues of impunity? What would happen if we were to terminate those protections?
What we have seen from the regional process that I just described earlier is that there is a real commitment in the countries on the region to tackle their problems. I don't think they want to shy away from it.
Right.
They make not only political statements and political commitment, but actually have developed action plans through which they believe they are going to be addressing the problem of forced displacement. So I believe that's something that needs to be taken at face value for what it is, and we need to continue working with this government to make sure that they implement those commitments and they deliver upon it. Certainly, this is a moment that requires patience and calm, and making sure that these countries are not subjected to a situation where they would face further challenges. They've just gone through when we were in Honduras, we were just looking at the aftermath of a storm that literally flooded the entire capital, and seeing how challenging the situation was. That there clearly it's an indication that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to support these countries in providing for their population, in supporting their population. I do not think that a return of hundreds of thousands of people would be the ideal situation for these countries, for sure. I do believe that rather than having a situation like that, we'd be better placed in trying to support them in doing what they want to do and what they're trying to do better. It would be pretty catastrophic situation, for sure.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you said that, because that's been my experience when I've talked to representatives from the government. When I was in El Salvador in January, and part of the challenge in dealing with gangs and other criminal groups is, the ability to offer alternatives. Where are the jobs? Where's the opportunity? Part of it is professionalizing their police force, and part of it is supporting attorney generals who will bring cases, of criminal activity against those who abuse human rights. Part of it is, dealing with the bigger issue of impunity. And the idea of and this is the thing that I'm concerned that there's not more discussion about, since we're on the eve potentially of an announcement on TPS, is that it would be devastating. It would be devastating. It's not that these countries don't want to deal with the challenges, as you pointed out. It's not that they don't want to find a solution. It's just it's like they're drinking water from a fire hose as it is, trying to deal with what's going on in their countries. There's no way they could absorb an influx of people in the amount that would be potentially returned if we didn't extend TPS, or if we were to end the protection for the Dreamers.
The U.S. government is doing the right thing through the Alliance for Prosperity in trying to secure neighborhoods, and slowly but surely from the bottom up, really trying to protect those neighborhoods. I think that work needs to continue and reinforce and strengthen. And that's perhaps the way in which we are going to see a change and an improvement in that region. And I do encourage you to continue doing that, because that's the right way forward.
Well, and we support that. Again, I wish we were doing that. We had done that more aggressively in the aftermath of the conflict in places like El Salvador. Maybe we would be having a very different discussion right now, but we didn't. The international community didn't. And as a result, we're dealing with, a country that was broken by the war and is still trying to rebuild. But I just think I want to be clear. I think I think it is essential that TPS be continued. I think if we were to end this program prematurely right now, the impact on some of these countries would be devastating. And so all these other issues, all these other things we're doing, I don't think would matter very much, to be honest with you. I'm just telling you my analysis of the situation.
Ideally, people who have a lot to contribute to the country should at some point be going back and contributing to their communities. And I'm sure that many Hondurans and Salvadorians and Guatemala would want to do that. There's a place and a time for everything, and perhaps moderating that approach is something that would be in the benefit of the United States at the long term.
Right, but I want to be emphatic here. The idea of ending these programs now would be devastating. And I've been to the border, and I've interviewed some of these teenagers coming over the border from Honduras and El Salvador. These young kids whose parents have spent every penny they have to smuggle them to the border of the United States because they're afraid they would be killed if they remained in their own country. You know, young women who would become sex slaves to gangs, young boys who would be forced to join criminal gangs if they didn't escape, and basically condemn their lives to criminal activity. I mean, so I agree with you on the types of things we ought to be supporting, but as we try to support them, understand we can't make things worse. And yeah, I want, people, there are a lot of people who want to go back. But quite frankly, the situation in some of these countries right now, especially in El Salvador, is as dangerous as it was during the war. The number of people being killed today is higher than was during the war. So, but I appreciate the work that UNHCR is doing, and we certainly support your work, but I wanted to be clear in this hearing that it would be a major mistake, a step backwards, a step toward creating more chaos in Central America if we don't deal with extending these protections to people who are currently in this country. And I hope that the administration will do that. I yield to my colleague from Illinois.
I certainly endorse what you're saying, and that let's hope that we don't create yet another explosive hotspot around the world by making a terrible mistake on both TPS and what we do regarding DACA. We're fighting very hard to pass the DREAM Act to protect those young people. I guess what I would say, yes, I'm worried about criminal gangs, and certainly to the extent that countries are serious about going after the criminal gangs. But, what I see in Honduras, which I've been involved in since what I call the coup, and which the United States called a coup for about 5 minutes, that there are labor union activists, there are journalists, there are people like Berta, Caceres, who are fighting for their indigenous communities against powerful corporate interests, which I think assume impunity. And there does seem to be evidence that the builders of the dam were responsible for her death. But the government of Honduras had that information as well. So I guess that I am less optimistic about the strategy of just working with governments to do what they, from what I hear you saying, we should assume that they want to do. Because I think that there are targeted communities that the government is unwilling to protect at the very least, and maybe cooperative in targeting at the worst, that make it a real problem that for the United States to, in a sense, collaborate with those governments, provide funding, et cetera, for the military and beyond. And that it's very important that we call out and that the international community through the United Nations participate in that too, that governments can be culpable.
Thank you very much. The work that UNHCR does in the region is multi-pronged. Our main responsibility, of course, is to work with governments, all governments. It's part and parcel of the way the United Nations operates. But we, of course, are present in communities that are at risk. We every day have colleagues in dangerous areas protecting people, building safe houses, working with NGO communities, working with all actors on the ground to make sure that we identify people who are at risk, that we protect them to the best way possible through the establishment of safe houses, and we evacuate those who are not able to be protected in situ. So our work is targeting a number of areas. It's not just focused on governments, but as an institution that is being established by governments, we of course have a responsibility to make sure that those governments commit to doing the right thing and that we support them in doing the right thing to the extent possible and to the extent that they can. And very cognizant of the fact that there are challenges and problems. We work across the region in neighboring countries, in Mexico, in Belize, in Costa Rica, in Panama, and everywhere else, and in the United States for that matter, to make sure to support asylum systems that are strong, that are able to receive people, that we are there at the first port of entry to make sure that the family who's crossing the border with their children is able to have a house, a roof over their head, and is able and understanding what is an asylum procedures, and is able to go through it and has a fair hearing at the end. So it's a very comprehensive approach that we're taking. And considering that 2 years ago, very little was happening in terms of asylum in this region, and that today we are having the numbers that we have and the responses that we have, I think it is telling on how the strategy is working, and that the only way possible is to be closer to the people and be able to respond to their needs, whenever they occur. So that's what I could say about the work of the organization does.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I think we just had a vote, but before I let you go, let me just ask one other question, and maybe you could kind of give us kind of some guidance here. What are the conditions that need to be in place before people are returned to a country that has experienced violence? In other words, like what are the conditions in places like El Salvador and Honduras that need to be in place before it would be appropriate for the United States to send somebody back?
I can talk about refugee protection because the agency is
Right.
about
Well, yeah,
refugee
that's right. Yeah.
protection.
So I mean, I just,
So-
so like when would it be? I mean, because refugees are, oftentimes fleeing violence, and so there's a lot of violence going on still, unfortunately, notwithstanding the good intentions of some people in the governments. And I guess the question is what needs to be in place?
So when it comes to refugees, what we advocate for is that every person who is seeking protection has a chance to a fair hearing and is going through a due process that is usually a system that it's effective and fair. And only when a person has gone through all the stages of the adjudication and it's found not to be in need of international protection, the person can be returned to a country.
Right.
So that's the framework.
No, and I
Now, when it
understand how
comes
the asylum system works, but but we're now dealing with people who are not necessarily applying for asylum. They've gotten temporary protected status. People who are dreamers, people who have sent their kids here. People who have come here fleeing the violence, but have not necessarily, gone through the I've applied for asylum process.
Okay, if I could just say, though, that the Attorney General of the United States called, was it dirty lawyers, that teach people, coach them to talk about credible fear, even if it's not really there. I mean, we have a real problem in often accepting people as refugees. If that's going to be the attitude, I think, of the highest law enforcement officer.
Well, I guess my point simply, and I appreciate that, which makes me concerned about everybody, but clearly, I mean, the UNHCR, has recommendations that it is not safe to send refugees back to Syria or back to countries where there's a lot of turmoil. I mean, you'd object to that because of the conditions on the ground. And I guess, I am, when I was in El Salvador in January, I was in Honduras not too long ago. I mean, the conditions on the ground, there's not a war as, a formal war going on necessarily, but the level of violence is pretty intense. And as well as I do, that people are fleeing that violence and people are internally displaced. I just think it's important that there be a clear, indication to our government here in the United States that, look, conditions on the ground in many of these countries in Central America are still very desperate. And they are not conducive to, ending protections en masse. And I think, and I'm just wondering, like, what has to be in place to change that reality?
We have been pretty vocal about the situation in the northern triangle of Central America. We have been saying that we are concerned about a growing situation of violence. And we are also saying that not everybody is fleeing for protection-related reason, but increasingly a larger number are. And we are concerned about the type of profiles that we're seeing across the region. We are concerned about the fact that we are seeing everything from policemen to children to families to teachers seeking protection and obtaining that protection. So we have been pretty vocal about that. As a UN Refugee Agency, we also have to be very careful and mindful of our mandate. We cannot extend ourselves to talking about a whole group of people when it's not our responsibility to do so. This being said, it's not up to us to talk about temporary protection and whether that protection should be ended or not. It's not within our realm of responsibilities, nor is it our responsibility to talk about DACA. Generally speaking, as I said earlier, we are concerned about security in a lot of these neighborhoods, and certainly returning people in large numbers to situations of violence is not perhaps a good idea. But that's as far as I can talk about.
No, and I appreciate that, and I know it's, you're in a sensitive position. It's just, I just believe that a mass, deportation of people to some of these countries would make the situation for internally displaced, for refugees, more dangerous. I think it's just, to me, it's very, very clear. And again, the level of violence in some of these countries is intense. You're right, not everybody leaves because they're fleeing violence, but I would argue that the majority of people that I have met here, many of them who are undocumented, have left because they're worried about protecting the lives of their kids. And that hasn't changed. And when I was in El Salvador in January, I was in Honduras, I think a year before, that was still the issue. And so, but this commission appreciates the work of the UNHCR. We are so happy you are there, and we look forward to working with you. And thank you for coming here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman.
And we're going to temporarily to vote, and then we will be right back.
extremely happy that, you know, we
I apologize, but I have no control over our schedule, so. And I'd like to call our next panel to the table. Dr. Carlos E. Ponce, the Director of the for Latin America Programs at Freedom House. Adriana Beltran heads the Citizenry Security Program for the Washington Office on Latin America. Lisa Hogard is the Executive Director of the Latin America Working Group Education Fund. Rachel Dodson is Gender and Migration Initiatives Director for the Kids in Need of Defense, known as KIND. And Ashley Feasley is a lawyer, published author, and Director of Policy for the Office of Migration and Refugee Services of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I would also like to submit for the record the written submissions a written statement from Oxfam America. The executive summary of the report titled Dam Violence by GAIPE, the International Advisory Group of Expert Persons, on the March 2, 2016 assassination of Honduran human rights defender Berta Isabel Caceres Flores. The executive summary of the June 2017 KIND report titled Childhood Cut Short, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Against Central American Migrant and Refugee Children. The full KIND report entitled Neither Security Nor Justice, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence and Gang Violence in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. 2 articles by the Latin America Working Group titled Honduras, Space for Activists and Journalists, Closing, wide open for corruption, dated October 23, 2017, and Nowhere to Call Home, Internally Displaced in Honduras and El Salvador, dated October 31, 2017. I'd like to submit the executive summary of the October 2016 Amnesty International report titled Home Sweet Home, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador's Role in a Deepening Refugee Crisis. Additional materials may be forthcoming, and now that I'm out of breath, Mr. Ponce, we will begin with you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chairman McGovern, and members of the Commission. It's an honor for me to testify before you today, and it's an honor for Freedom House to be invited and share with you some of our views about the region. Freedom House was founded in 1941 and to promote democracy and freedom around the world. And we have a unique combination of research, programming, and advocacy. We have our main report, Freedom of the World, Freedom of the Press, and Freedom of the Net, and all report assess the political rights and civil liberties, media freedom, and internet freedom in all the countries. And we rank countries as free, partly free, and not free. We also carry on programs in several Latin American countries. In particular, we have programs in Honduras, we have programs in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and we support some human rights groups in Nicaragua. We also have a program to support human rights defenders and to support journalists around the world. So far, we have been protecting 300 individuals in Central America, persecuted by different groups in all of these countries. We also have been trying to promote systems to protect human rights defenders and journalists in several countries in Central America. There are different challenges in Central America. We believe that all the countries face numerous challenges, but impunity for us is the primary issue in all of these countries. In the Northern Triangle, all the countries are on the verge of a crisis or in a crisis. Weak rule of law, dysfunctional institutions are responsible for epidemic violence, corruption, and insecurity. Thousands of citizens risk their life as they are internally displaced or decided to migrate to neighbor countries onto the U.S., and the situation is worsening over the time. numerous programs have been trying to attempt to address this problem, but lack of systematic approach and long-term planning it diminished the result. Weak political parties and unreliable electoral authorities and failure to the judiciary to sanction wrongdoing, creating a weak democracy in the region. Countries like Guatemala, with 400, 550 homicide, and the recent fight from President Morales against the CICIG, one of the functional institution in Guatemala, and also the fights against the Attorney General. We have a great concern about the election of the new Attorney General in Guatemala, because it's the only instrument that guarantee the fight against corruption and impunity in Guatemala. In El Salvador, we have been seeing that Maras block and unplug the violence in El Salvador. Even though there have been a reduce in crime levels and homicide this year, last week in El Salvador, 2 weeks ago, El Salvador proved that the Maras can block the violence again. And 196 people killed just in 1 week, and an average of 28 murders per day proved that the situation in El Salvador is getting worse, and more in terms of the violence and the use of death squads in El Salvador. Our organization has been investigating about death squads, and we have to call that by its names, even though the U.S. tries not to call that as death squads and extrajudicial killing. They are extrajudicial killing, they are death squads, and they have been operating in El Salvador, and impunity is one of the bases of their operation. Recent attacks against El Faro and Revista Factum, the threats against those journalists, because they have been reporting the operation of this death squads in El Salvador with elite forces operating in El Salvador. In the case of Honduras, we categorize Honduras as not free. Even though the MASI has been operating in Honduras, corruption is still a major problem in Honduras. In Honduras, it's different than in El Salvador and in Guatemala in terms of the protection of journalists and human rights defenders. In Honduras, there is a mechanism to protect human rights defenders and to protect journalists. But the problem with Honduras, even though this mechanism has been evaluating the risk of 200 of those journalists and human rights defenders, and more than 67 are under protection, the lack of a system to investigate threats against journalists, human rights defenders, and community leaders, it's a problem in Honduras. Berta Caceres received 33 death threats, and nobody investigates those threats. Now the situation remains the same. We have been pushing the government of Honduras, we have been pushing the Attorney General to create a special unit to investigate all the threats against human rights defenders and against journalists. We believe that the solution is not creating mechanisms to protect human rights defenders or journalists. The solution is investigate why they're under attack and who is attacking them, and effective protection measures against this human rights defender and journalists. The election in Honduras is gonna create more crisis and more violence in Honduras. We're really concerned about the process. We're really concerned also about the selection of the new Attorney General in Honduras. Even though this Attorney General has been really effective, the problem is that selection process in Honduras is non-transparent and can create more problems in terms of lack of rule of law in Honduras. In Nicaragua, it's also a problem for us because of the deaths and threats against indigenous leaders, against the Mezquitos, and against the people that fight for their rights in the areas of the proposed interoceanic canal. Campesinos, leaders have been fighting for the right of their land and to an open consultation. We believe that the situation in Nicaragua also shows the lack of independent institutions. So for us at Freedom House, it's the same problem all over the region. Lack of rule of law, lack of strong institution, and impunity all over. Thank you very much.
Ms. Beltran?
Good afternoon, Chairman McGovern, Representative Czakowski. Thank you. Oh, is it on? Yep. Thank you for the opportunity to come here today. I'm going to focus my remarks on talking about the impact of organized crime and corruption on human rights in Central America. As we've discussed, the governments of Central America face serious problems of insecurity, violence, impunity, and corruption. Problems they have so far been unable to tackle effectively. As we witnessed with the surge of unaccompanied minors arriving at the southern border, these issues have had the greatest impact on those living in Central America's northern triangle. Despite important reductions in overall homicide rates, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala continue to rank among the most violent countries in the hemisphere and the world. In 2016, El Salvador registered 81.2 homicides for every 100,000 inhabitants, making it the second most violent of the past 12 years. And while the violence decreased since its peak in 2015, this decrease has been accompanied by a heavy-handed police crackdown and a disturbing pattern of abuse and extrajudicial executions carried out by the security forces, as my colleague Carlos mentioned. In neighboring Guatemala and Honduras, we've also seen decreases of violence, but again, these were high enough to rank them among the third and fifth most violent countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Some of this violence can be attributed to organized crime. The Northern Triangle has become an important transit route for illicit drugs and other illegal goods making their way north. Local smuggling operations working as contractors for transnational cartels have contributed to violence along the border areas and to the rise of corruption and corrosion of justice and security systems. Street gangs also contribute to the high levels of violence. MS-13, 18th Street, and other smaller gangs enforce curfews, control entry into their neighborhoods, and corrupt local officials. These groups engage in turf battles and rely on the extortion of local businesses and residents, as well as express kidnappings in order to support themselves. Each year, an estimated $661 million is paid in extortion fees to local gangs throughout the region. Too often, failure to pay can result in harassment, violence, or death. The gangs aggressively recruit underage boys and girls, forcing many to drop out of schools or relocate. The high levels of corruption and weakness of state institutions are key factors in explaining this epidemic levels of violence. This corruption has allowed criminal networks to thrive and co-opt state institutions and has exacted tremendous economic cost. It has jeopardized the ability of the governments in the Northern Triangle to provide adequate health, education, and welfare services. A recent study found that losses from emblematic corruption cases in Honduras were the equivalent of 70% of the budget for the Department of Health and 35% of the budget of the Department of Education. In El Salvador, the total losses from corruption would have been able to fund approximately 1.2 million boys and girls with school lunch and health services. Corruption and neglect have also resulted in weak and ineffective criminal justice institutions. In all three countries, citizens do not feel that the police will protect them and often fear them more than the gangs. On average, 19 out of 20 murders in the region remain unsolved. This means that the likelihood of being caught, prosecuted, or convicted for murder are practically nil. Across the region, attorney general offices have tried to strengthen their ability to prosecute crime and corruption networks, but these offices remain understaffed, susceptible to outside pressure, and absent in many areas of the countries. In Guatemala, for example, only 10% of municipalities have prosecutors' offices, leaving many areas with high crime rates defenseless. The court systems are similarly overburdened. Judges can be bought, influenced, or manipulated. Not only has this allowed criminal networks to operate freely, it has also widened the gap between the rich and the poor by reserving justice only to those who can buy it. Given this context, it is not surprising that children and families consider fleeing their communities in search of safety and protection. There are important actors in the region, some in key government positions, some in innovative internationally backed organizations, and some in civil society who are leading reform efforts. It is important that we continue to support the attorneys generals, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, or CICIG, and the mechanism to support the fight against corruption and impunity in Honduras, or MOXIE. These institutions are on the front lines of combating corruption and have achieved important results. Their efforts, however, have faced pushback from sectors both within and outside of government that have been seeking to undermine their efforts. In Guatemala, the CICIG and its leadership and the Attorney General have been target of smear campaigns, and most most recently, the president sought to weaken the CICIG by declaring the head of the commission persona non grata and ordering his immediate expulsion from the country. In closing, I just want to say that it's important to note that responding to the levels of violence, widespread corruption, and poor governors cannot be solved overnight. It requires a long-term commitment, first and foremost by the Central American governments themselves, but also by the U.S. and other bilateral donors. Corruption and institutional weakness are enormous obstacles obstructing human rights, and it is vital that the conditions on U.S. assistance receive strong support from Congress and be met by regional governments. Thank you.
Ms. Hogard?
Thank you to the co-chairs, Representatives McGovern and Hultgren, for the opportunity to testify, and to Representative Schakowsky for her longstanding concerns on these issues. I will focus my remarks on security and human rights challenges facing two of the countries in the region, Honduras and El Salvador. Honduras and El Salvador remain two of the most dangerous countries on earth not at war. Adriana explained the homicide statistics. Many Salvadoran and Hondurans' lives are affected every day by the brutal impact of gang control of neighborhoods. Teenagers and children are forcibly recruited. Gangs levy extortion taxes that affect everyone from tortilla sellers to restaurant owners. People are killed for being unable to pay. Youth are killed in gang warfare. Many Salvadorans and Hondurans have to leave their homes due to violence, are internally displaced, and then may have to flee the country. Tough public security strategies may have reduced homicides in the last 2 years in both countries, but the rates are still stratospheric. The gains may be temporary, and the strategies each country is pursuing come with high human rights costs. In Honduras, a police reform initiative launched after police were implicated in the assassinations of the drug czar and his advisor resulted in several thousand personnel, including officials, being purged from the police. This marks a more serious effort than previous failed reforms. Yet few dismissed police have been brought to justice so far. Lack of punishment undermines disincentives for corruption and abuse. Dismissed police may join private security or organized crime. Meanwhile, the Honduran government has deployed military to police streets and even schools. The government promises the United States that this is a temporary strategy that will be phased out when the civilian police have been strengthened. Yet the Honduran government is expanding the role of the military in policing. In July, 2 new battalions in San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa were deployed, bringing the number of troops to 5,000. Military police have been involved in extrajudicial executions, torture, robbery, and rape. Their methods fail to address impunity or adequately protect communities. A pervasive problem in Honduras is harsh repression of protests. Use of tear gas, beating protesters, and attacking or harassing journalists covering protests are regular tactics. State security agents are also used as enforcers for mining, dam, palm plantations, and other projects that face community opposition. This has been amply documented in the case of the assassination of indigenous leader Berta Caceres. Honduran prosecutors charged former and current military members and employees of the dam company with her murder. But according to an independent group of experts, which just released its report yesterday, as you referred to, Representative Schakowsky, the investigation has failed to reach the intellectual authors. The Honduran legislature just moved to toughen penalties for protest and for journalists covering them with substantial prison terms for those who gravely affect the public peace or for coverage deemed apology for terrorism. This could affect protesters who block roads or journalists who report on them. At the same time, the legislature reduced penalties for crimes of corruption. This could benefit, among others, government officials implicated in sacking $300 million from the healthcare system and channeling $3 million into the governing Nationalist Party campaign, crimes that are still largely unpunished. Little wonder, then, that Honduras remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world for human rights defenders and journalists, risks that have spiraled since the 2009 coup. And I could go into some more statistics on that in my written testimony. But turning to El Salvador, the current Sanchez-Cerén administration developed a balanced plan for addressing terrifying levels of violence Plan El Salvador Seguro. The plan features prevention and rehabilitation, victim services, employment generation, and law enforcement. The government is rolling out the plan intensively in targeted municipalities with high levels of violence. This includes ramped-up police sweeps and military police patrols. Then, national and municipal governments are supposed to expand social programs, including violence prevention and victim services. The United States, UNDP, and other donors provide important support for these efforts. On paper, there is quite a bit in this plan to support. In practice, however, it's a return to hardline mano dura policies that are most evident. Pressure from the legislature and public demand for tough measures make it difficult for the Salvadoran government to adhere to a balanced strategy. Inadequate resources are given for victims, for prevention and rehabilitation, and most concerning of all, as my colleagues mentioned, abuses by public security forces, particularly police, are escalating. Extrajudicial executions of suspected gang members by police or army members, as well as vigilante squads or death squads, are a deeply troubling development in El Salvador today. Online magazines El Faro and Revista Factum have documented supposed shootouts between police and alleged gang members in which all gang members are killed and police emerge unscathed. Although there have been advances in investigating some cases, rights groups caution that the Attorney General has focused on prosecuting the most high-profile cases and those in which bystanders, rather than alleged gang members, have been killed, and the prosecutions of some of those have not gone well. Humanitarian agencies also report that teenage boys and young men from poor neighborhoods innocent of gang involvement get routinely targeted by police action. Many Salvadoran officials vehemently deny that there is a state policy that has promoted extrajudicial executions. However, extrajudicial executions in El Salvador seem to have escalated so much in such a short period of time that it seems likely that state policies permit it, and at least in an informal sense even encourage them. These abuses are tolerated and rarely punished. Poor internal controls within the police fail to catch problems before they escalate. Public pressure for action at any cost against the gangs and similar statements from officials encourage abuses. In April 2016, the Salvadoran Congress passed extraordinary measures to crack down on jailed criminals conducting illicit activities from prison. While the intent was understandable and may have contributed to a drop in homicides, the measures also ended access of many prisoners to rehabilitation, limited their access to lawyers, had an impact on health, resulting in a rise in TB, and curtailed access of judges to oversee prisoners' treatment. Jailed gang members completing their sentences will be returning to communities without rehabilitation. U.S. policy can help or further aggravate the situation of public security and human rights in El Salvador and Honduras. And in any questions, I would be happy to talk about ways the U.S. can address this.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dotson. And just make sure you put the mic on there.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the co-chairs and members of the commission for inviting us to testify today. Kids in Need of Defense and the Human Rights Center Fray Matias de Cordova in Chiapas, Mexico, recently published 2 reports documenting sexual and gender-based violence against Central American migrant children in their places of origin and transit. For the reports, we interviewed 60 migrant children and reviewed the legal case files of an additional 36 kind clients. We also interviewed 78 civil society and government representatives in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Mexico. Our research demonstrated that it is severe and widespread sexual and gender-based violence, combined with an almost complete lack of access to protection and justice, that forces many Central Americans, especially women, children, and LGBTI people, to flee their countries in search of safety. These brutal forms of violence driving child migration from Central America include child sexual abuse, domestic violence, gang-based sexual violence, human trafficking and sexual exploitation, and gender-based violence against LGBTI children and youth. Sexual violence perpetrated by gangs is one of the most common forms of this violence. In the urban and increasingly rural areas where gangs dominate, women and girls are in constant danger of being targeted for sexual violence. Gangs use rape and the threat of rape as a tactic to control the territories and populations where they operate, to control the behavior of girls and their families, and to punish those who don't comply with the rules imposed by the gang. For example, in many cases, girls are kidnapped and raped in order to punish their families for failure to pay extortion to the gangs, or as a warning to the girl's brother who attempted to resist forced recruitment by the gang. In some cases, girls and women are tortured, mutilated, and killed, and their bodies are left in public spaces to demonstrate to the entire community the absolute power of the gang and the consequences for those who resist their authority. Young women and girls, including girls as young as age 13 or 14, are also frequently targeted for forced relationships with gang members. Girls who resist these advances face violence or even death. Girls and young women in these relationships are trapped in situations of sexual and in some cases domestic servitude. Any attempt to leave the relationship is seen as an affront to the gang and is punishable with violence toward the victim and often her entire family. Attempts by victims to relocate within the country are often futile. Gangs track them down and ruthlessly punish them. To understand why survivors of these forms of violence flee their countries to seek safety, it is essential to understand the context of widespread impunity in the Northern Triangle. While Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras have progressive laws related to sexual and gender-based violence on the books, in reality, these laws are rarely enforced. When victims report rape or domestic violence, they face a barrage of obstacles to gaining protection and achieving justice. Judicial institutions are often physically inaccessible for victims who live in rural or marginal urban areas. Police officers and other officials sometimes refuse to take reports, blame victims for what happened to them, or even to subject them to sexual harassment or abuse. And there is an almost complete lack of protection mechanisms in place for those who do report, leaving victims vulnerable to further violence during and after the judicial process. Similar obstacles exist in the child protection systems, which are severely underfunded and often fail to protect children from violence. The situation is even graver when gangs or other organized criminal groups are involved. Reporting gang violence puts victims and witnesses at great risk of retaliation or death. Officials are often unwilling or unable to intervene in cases of gang-related violence, or even in cases of domestic violence or child abuse that are committed in gang-controlled areas. For example, officials are often unable to enter into gang-dominated areas to deliver restraining orders or to investigate child abuse reports. In other cases, corrupt police, prosecutors, and other officials work in collusion with gangs and may inform the gang that the victim has made a report, putting her in grave danger of retaliation by the gang. Access to protection for victims is also severely limited in cases where gangs are involved. Few shelters exist for victims of domestic violence, and those that do exist often will not shelter victims when the aggressor is a gang member, due to fear for the safety of staff and other residents. Central America has simply become unsafe for women, girls, and LGBTI people, and without significant institutional reforms to address sexual and gender-based violence and impunity, victims will continue fleeing for their lives. The United States should commit to substantial and long-term foreign assistance to the region and ensure that sexual and gender-based violence prevention and response programming, as well as gang violence prevention programming, are priority areas for foreign assistance from all U.S. agencies to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And finally, the United States should ensure that funding to Central America supports government efforts to address violence generated by gangs and other organized criminal groups and to meaningfully fight corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Feasley, welcome.
Good afternoon. Co-Chairman McGovern and Representative Schakowsky, on behalf of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity today to speak about Central America, human rights and humanitarian challenges. The institutional Catholic Church has strong ties to Central America and provides extensive partnership with the Guatemalan, Honduran, and Salvadoran governments to help facilitate migrant protection and reintegration efforts. Through the work of Catholic Relief Services, the bishops oversees humanitarian arm, as well as the work of several religious orders such as the Jesuits and the Scalabrinians, the Catholic Church has a large presence in the region. I'd like to begin my remarks with a story that I heard on the recent bishop's delegation trip to El Salvador and Honduras in August, and I asked that the corresponding report, Temporary Protected Status, a vital key to the Central American protection and prosperity puzzle, be admitted into the record. Maria was an altar girl at her church and a good student in school in her Honduran community located outside Tegucigalpa. A gang moved into the abandoned house next to Maria's family's home. The police started to survey the house due to the gang's presence. the gang assumed that Maria and her family had complained to the police about their presence next door. Shortly after the police complaints, gang members came over during the day and beat Maria's mother and grandmother while Maria was at school and her father was at work. The gang turned up the music in the house to drown out the cries as they beat both mother and grandmother. Maria's family returned, and her father was told that the family had 24 hours to vacate the house and the neighborhood. Devastated and scared for their lives, the family immediately moved to a new and equally unsafe neighborhood that an extended relative lived in. Due to the move, Maria had to leave her school and her father had to quit his job, as he feared that the gang would come to find him due to the job's proximity to the old house. Despite some assistance from a Catholic priest from Maria's old parish and NGO organizations, the family had to relocate again and continues to live in extreme fear and insecurity today. Sadly, Maria's story is not unique. Throughout our work in the region and on the delegation trip, particularly in El Salvador and Honduras, we heard continuing stories of gang and community violence that is being targeted at family units, occurring and creating situations of forced displacement in all three countries of the Northern Triangle. There are a few findings from our report that I'm going to briefly summarize. First is the large increases in internal displacement. Within Honduras, there are an estimated 174,000 individuals who are internally displaced. In El Salvador, there's approximately a range of 220,000 to 400,000 who are internally displaced. While internally displaced people do not qualify as a refugee under the international definition, they are extremely vulnerable and susceptible to protection needs and also remigration concerns. During our delegation trip, we saw large-scale internal displacement as well as targeted violence at family units. In evaluating the capacity of the governments to respond to such migration-related issues, we found that there is a real uphill battle for governments to address the current extent of gang violence and subsequent internal displacement. Similarly, our institutional Catholic partners on the ground are stretched very thin dealing with current internal displacement phenomena and also helping to minister protection and aid to the steady stream of returned nationals and unaccompanied children. Second, while noting some of the small but incremental progress that has occurred for Honduras and El Salvador's existing migrant protection systems, there is concern about both governments and the Catholic Church's ability to respond to larger waves of returnees if certain existing immigration programs, such as temporary protected status and the Central American Minors Refugee Program, are not continued. Existing capacity on the ground to humanely accept the large numbers of returned nationals will be a severe challenge that could undermine the regional security of the region. It is with these concerns in mind that we urge robust funding for the Northern Triangle humanitarian and integration initiatives, and we also are urging the administration to maintain current immigration programs for Hondurans and Salvadorans, such as temporary protected status. The prosperity of the region is very much related to the continuation of TPS. Finally, as decisions related to TPS are being evaluated by the administration, we urge Congress to consider a legislative solution that addresses the issue of Central American long-term TPS recipients who have lived in the United States in many cases for at least 20 years and have long-standing equities such as U.S. citizen children, businesses, and home mortgages that in every sense of the word could be considered national interest of the United States government. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your excellent testimony and insight. I'm going to yield to my colleague, Ms. Schakowsky, because we have she's another meeting coming up, so I'll give her the first crack at questions. So
Let me ask, though, is there a
legislative
policy on the table when it comes to TPS?
Well, there are a couple of bills that have been introduced in case the administration makes the wrong decision and decides to end it. But, I mean, I think in all honesty here, we're going to be faced with the same kind of dilemma we're faced with the Dreamers, and that is getting it scheduled and getting it to the floor. My hope is that the administration will, I mean, based on the merits, decide to extend it. You know, I mentioned at the beginning, I began my career here working for Congressman Joe Moakley. He's the author of the TPS language, and it was written in response to the Salvadorans being deported. You know, you can use it to help protect people in the face of natural disasters, and you can use it to protect people from human rights violations. You know, it still applies very directly to the countries that we're talking about here today. So, yeah, there are some legislative vehicles out there, but we're going to have to, you know. But I would much prefer the administration to extend this, and then hopefully we will get to a point where we can have a conversation, especially with regard to the Salvadorans who have been here for 16 years. You know, I mean, who are here legally for 16 years. Some of them have bought houses, they own businesses, they get married. I mean, the idea that after 16 years, right, after 16 years you're going to just rip these families apart is just inhumane. But I worry that the current political climate is such that it's difficult to have that conversation. But in the short term, we got to pressure the administration to not terminate these programs.
Cool. Well, my question is actually pretty specific about Berta Caceres, and I wanted to ask whoever can best answer it. And I don't know if Lisa, maybe it's you, I don't know, or Adriana, Carlos, whatever. So as we all know, on March 3rd, 2016, Honduran human rights activist Berta Caceres was murdered in her home. She was the co-founder and coordinator of COPIN, the Council of Popular Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. She was internationally renowned for her courageous work defending indigenous land rights and opposing environmentally destructive mega projects. At the time of her death, Berta and COPIN were organizing against the construction of a dam on the Gualcarque, is that river. Documents received by Ms. Caceres' family and reviewed by a team of 5 international lawyers showed that her murder was organized by senior executives of the company known as DESA, the Honduran company that was slated to build the dam. The executives were so confident in their impunity that they did little to hide their efforts to orchestrate her murder. The Honduran government has had these incriminating documents for a year and a half, but they have yet to request the arrest of any high-level executives in the hydroelectric company. Given this case, can anyone really have confidence in the Honduran government's support for efforts to end this end corruption? The Honduran government's investigative team and the prosecutor's office receive financial aid from the United States. So what concerns does that raise in your mind for the United States in terms of our support for a government that is failing to carry out justice even in the face of clear evidence? Those are my questions. I'll leave it to you.
Yes, indeed. The group of experts, which just came out with a report yesterday and revealed in a press conference in Tegucigalpa yesterday, and we'll be talking here tomorrow at 2:30 in the Congress.
I got to meet with them last week,
yeah.
which was great, yeah.
Well, they, as you very accurately describe, they had a part of the evidence that was available to the Attorney General's Office of Honduras, only a part of it, but they had many text messages and phone messages that they were reviewing, and it clearly indicated to them, and frankly to anybody who reads it, and it's you can read the messages in the report, that the 8 people who have been charged with the murder were not the intellectual authors of the murder, that in fact Berta Caceres and others had been followed intensively by the dam company, working closely with the local police who seemed to be under the sway of the dam company, and that all of that surveillance led up to the targeted assassination of Berta Caceres, and now we still have continuing problems of attacks and harassment and surveillance of Copine and Berta Caceres' family. So the Honduran Attorney General's office had this information, has more information, and has not acted in regards to the intellectual authors, although they have slowly reacted to the material, on the question of the material authors. So this case, it moved forward in the beginning because there was a lot of international pressure, including State Department pressure as one piece of it. So it moves forward with pressure. So it really needs very strong pressure to move beyond the material authors to the intellectual authors. And I just emphasize that although we know a lot about Berta Caceres' case, these cases are all over Honduras. Right. Mining companies, palm plantations, other dam projects, and community opposition to these projects. And there's such a close connection between maybe shady companies and corrupt security forces and officials, that is really what international pressure needs to focus on.
Let me ask you this: what is likely to be? Do we know yet, as of today, the official response by the government to the release of this information and those documents?
I don't know the answer to that. I know it was not well covered in Honduras. One paper covered it. We will see what the response is, but I think it requires more than an NGO or an independent human rights lawyer's response, however great that has been, but it requires pressure from the U.S. government, other members of the international community.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment? Adriana?
Yes, and thank you so much for raising this case, because it's such an emblematic case of the issues of attacks against human rights defenders. I share the concerns that my colleague Lisa raised, and the concerns that were raised in the report regarding the role of the Attorney General in terms of just going after the intellectual authors, but there's also been issues and delays with sharing of information, which is the right of the family to get that information so that they know how the case is moving forward. And I think that is something very concrete where the U.S. and Congress can help with. I think the case also points to the issue of collusion and corruption, which, as my colleague Lisa mentioned, it doesn't just pertain to this case, but is a problem that you see throughout the country. And I think that's why the work of the MOXIE, the anti-corruption body that was established last year, could be so critical to addressing these issues. It's a body that, while different from the CICIG in Guatemala, I think has the potential to be able to try to strengthen the local capacity, but also to really get at the heart of this collusion and corruption in the country. I think the U.S. has an important role to play in terms of assistance, but I think that assistance also has to have very clear benchmarks. That's why the conditions are so important, and very clear indicators to ensure that we can measure and evaluate the commitment of the governments and their institutions to moving forward.
Well, because this case is so emblematic of what happens around the country and really the region, any guidance that you can give to us and me and my office on how to follow up now on this would be much appreciated.
Yeah, it's not only Berta Caceres an emblematic case, but there are too many cases in all these countries. And what we ask is of a systematic approach to all these cases, and also to have a special unit investigating the threats, the harassment of all the activists in all this country. Without that, we're going to have more cases like Berta Caceres. The environmental activist has been under attack in all of these countries. So what we ask is an approach not only to support the mass. Mass is a good thing, CSIC is a good thing. We need to keep that support, and we need to keep pressure in the Attorney General's office. Honduras has an ATIC that has been working efficiently in emblematic cases, but not in the investigation about threats against journalists, activists, and environmental community leaders. So we believe that more pressure in terms of the creating of this special unit and investment in investigating threats against those activists.
Well, thank you. I also wanted to point out, just going back to TPS if I could, that a number of us, 116 of us, signed a letter that I, along with my co-chair, Randy Hultgren of Illinois, put together, asking the administration to extend TPS. So Congress has weighed in with the administration, and my hope is that they'll listen to us. And I hope they wouldn't make any decision that would terminate these programs, certainly without consulting with the likes of some of the people on this panel here today who have firsthand experience about what's happening on the ground. You know, I'm recognizing that it's early to evaluate the U.S. strategy for engagement. Do any of you have any initial impressions or reflections? I mean, I'm trying to get at what are we doing that's right, and what are we not doing, or what are we doing that's wrong? I open this up to Beltran, or do you?
First of all, as you said, it's very early to tell. While the first tranche of assistance was approved in late 2015, it was only until late last year, early this year, that the funding began reaching the region. That said, I think that in principle, the approach of the strategy has been right, and I think it's important that we maintain a comprehensive approach that not just addresses the issues of security, but that looks at the issues of governance and corruption, which are so central to addressing these challenges, and to issues of economic development and ensuring that there are greater opportunities for children and for others in the region. I think in terms of security, the focus ought to be on how do you strengthen institutions. Much of what we talked about today deals with the weakness of institutions. So how do we ensure that there are effective, accountable civilian police forces? How do we ensure effective judicial bodies, independent judicial bodies, independent attorney generals? There are efforts that we have supported and that the strategy continues to support, which have been positive, have had a tremendous impact. And just to point to one, the support that we've given to the Attorney General in Guatemala and to the CSIC. CSIC has been in Guatemala for 10 years. It has been instrumental in addressing issues of impunity and this deeply entrenched corruption that I was describing. It has not just brought forth cases with the Attorney General's office since 2015 in particularly, that has really revealed the extent of corruption in the country, but more importantly, since its creation, it has moved forward a number of legal reforms, institutional reforms, that have made the institution function a lot better. And I could go into detail with that, but that is something that has received strong bipartisan support since the creation, and it's something that we ought to continue. I think MOXIE could play that role also in Guatemala. There have been efforts also, in the case of Guatemala, I would highlight to support the Ministry of the Interior, which has followed a very different approach under the current ministry to tackle issues of corruption very differently than the one we see in the case of El Salvador and Honduras.
Mr. Ponce?
There are some progress. It's not that nothing has been doing. There have some progress, and I think that the international community involvement create a more pressure for all these three governments to behave in some cases and to improve some institutions. Continue the support to the attorney generals in each one of these countries. Have key role from the international community and from the U.S. and the judiciary. It needs a long-term approach to reform the judiciary in the three countries, because that is the base of the problem of lack of rule of law in all of these countries.
Right. But do you think the attorney generals in the region have sufficient support? I mean, when I meet with these attorney generals, I mean, the backlog is like forever. And how do we help them? I mean, at some point they have to prioritize, I guess. And I mean, I think that's a huge problem down in some of these countries.
They don't have the budget in any of the countries.
Right.
They have to fight for every penny. There are more money that goes to security and other areas than the money that they allocate in
Right.
each one of these attorney general's offices.
would say in addition to resources, there are important reforms that don't require a penny from the local governments, but that require political will.
Right.
If you look at the case of Guatemala, they, since last year, the CICIG, the Attorney General, the courts have been trying to push constitutional reforms that would ensure greater independence and impartiality on the part of the courts, that would make the process of selection that Carlos mentioned a lot cleaner, more transparent, based on merit. So there are steps that I think they can take. There's also reforms that can be implemented internally. If you look at the case of Guatemala, just to give one example, one of the things that have made the institution function better is that, they started investigating patterns and structures rather than going on a case-by-case basis.
Right.
And that has allowed them to, make a lot of progress in terms of looking at issues of organized crime and corruption.
Excuse me?
I would say that there has been small but incremental progress in the area of protection and reintegration systems, particularly in the situation of Honduras. In 2014, after the large influx of unaccompanied children, we saw the standing up of a new child welfare organization, DNAF. It's an improved entity. We also saw the beginning of the law to protect Honduran migrants and their families. While these are small improvements, I will say the larger capacity to accept the return and integration of families, TPS families, other individuals is not existing currently. I think more development work needs to be done. As you heard from UNHCR, there is efforts by these countries to come to the table, but I think it's very important that we need to continue to rebuild these systems and look at them for larger reintegration capacities, not just immediate returns at the border or in some of the capital cities. The vital, I think, welfare of the people who are returned is woven into the ideas of preventing corruption and economic development, but also with meaningful integration and gang prevention education programs.
So good.
In terms of sort of the U.S. Strategy towards Central America, there's some good programs, but the diplomacy part of it needs to be stronger in terms of really pushing for rights-respecting public security. Those messages need to be heard loud and clear. If they're not heard from the administration, we would request that they be heard from the U.S. Congress. There are very good conditions attached to the legislation that on human rights and anti-corruption and public participation. Those need to be really enforced in a much more systematic and strong way, because it's not just a question of providing the assistance. There's such a question of political will that if this aid doesn't come with tough diplomacy, it's not going to work. I would also say U.S. assistance towards Central America, a perpetual problem is the lack of transparency. It's very difficult to track and follow. And so it makes actually it rather difficult to answer the question, is it working? Because so much, we just don't know what it is, despite talking with USAID quite a bit.
Ms. Dodson?
Yeah, thank you. So there have been some concrete and significant efforts to address sexual and gender-based violence, specifically by governments in the region. And some of these have had U.S. support. For example, the implementation of 24-hour courts in Guatemala for survivors of gender-based violence, and examples in other countries as well. And I would just emphasize that in efforts to strengthen judicial systems and efforts to prevent violence, it's extremely important to maintain that focus on sexual and gender-based violence as well, in terms of training and capacity building, ensuring sufficient funding and personnel for specialized units, police, courts, prosecutors focused on sexual and gender-based violence, and also in providing support for survivors. So that just the importance of continuing to make sure that gender issues and sexual and gender-based violence are a priority in all, both in the judicial reform and also in the prevention efforts.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. We're talking about victims, and and it just struck me that a lot of what we've been talking about are the most recent victims, but we've got victims that go back years and years and years to when conflicts were more civil wars essentially, and yet after all these years, there's been no justice in the cases of murders and disappearances, 30 years ago. And it seems very difficult to imagine how how you deal with issues of impunity, how you deal with issues of demanding that security forces respect the rights of civilians when, you know, we have all this backlog, if you will. And I'm just wondering how important you think it is to resolve some of these cases of not just a year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years ago, but 10, 20, 30 years ago. You know, I know in El Salvador they're reopening the El Mizote case where, you know, 900 people were massacred. You know, we'll see, you know, whether, you know, how far it goes. This case that the example I gave in the opening about this new commission that the Salvadoran government has put together to kind of help families whose loved ones were disappeared in the conflict be able to find the bones of their loved ones so they could actually bury them, you know, as a way to bring about closure. But, you know, I worry sometimes that people in these respective governments, and even in our government, kind of say, the past is the past is the past, let's move on and just deal with what's happening right now. And I don't know, and yet we've learned from history in various countries around the world, you really can't move forward unless you deal with the past. And I don't know whether anybody has any comments on that. Mr. Ponce?
Yeah, well, you see that in El Salvador, the failure to resolve the past. You have the problems that we have right now in El Salvador. Extrajudicial killing in El Salvador continue to be a problem because the failure to resolve that problem in the past. Same in Guatemala, failures to resolve problems in Guatemala. Now we see a lack of institution, lack of governance in all of these countries. So we have to solve the past and we have to work in the future in each one of these countries.
You mentioned extrajudicial killings, and what is the extent of extrajudicial killings in the region perpetrated by the police, military, or other security forces? And you know, are certain types of forces more responsible than others? And how often, in current day, are people who are guilty actually brought to justice? And to what extent are these security forces working on behalf of the governments or on behalf of criminal sectors in these countries?
In the case of El Salvador, we worked in documenting cases until last year. We documented 100 cases in El Salvador, and I work with several organizations in El Salvador and El Faro, and we work with the Human Rights Ombudsman, with the Procuraduría. Then the changes in the Procuraduría, that's why we are so concerned about the changes in the Attorney Generals, because changes in the Procuraduría in El Salvador ended all the investigations. At that time, they investigated 100 cases, and the Procuraduría at that moment identified the perpetrator for 47 cases. After that, there have been more and more reports documented by El Faro and other groups in El Salvador of numerous cases of elite members of the police and members of the military doing this kind of extrajudicial killing without any kind of investigation or any kind of sanctions against the perpetrators.
Yeah, just to add, you have extrajudicial executions occur in all of them, and mostly right now you hear a lot of news coming out of El Salvador. And just to highlight that, a lot of the information that you do obtain regarding extrajudicial executions comes from the work of investigative reporting or civil society organizations that at grave risk are trying to document some of these cases. One of the issues is with regards to the police and how the Internal Controls and Inspector General's office investigate these cases, which in the case of El Salvador, there's been very little to no movement in looking at those issues internally, but also the role of the Attorney Generals and the fact that, you know, as Carlos mentioned, the previous ombudsman had investigated a number of cases, but there's only been one case that I know of that has gone to trial, and they just lost that case.
Ms. Dawson, is there a country in the region? Is there one country that's dealing with the issue of violence against women and sexual minorities better than the others? I mean, is there somebody emerging as maybe a leader in this area? You know, where they may have established a dedicated police or public prosecutor unit to kind of combat this kind of violence? Is there one country we should be watching in particular as maybe an example or a model?
I would say that there are elements of the strategies of each country that could be emulated and built upon and expanded. There are limitations in each country as well, so I would hesitate to name one country as a sort of a model. There are differences in terms of the legislation. For example, El Salvador and Guatemala have in place comprehensive laws related to violence against women. Honduras at this point is considering such a law, and it hasn't been put in place. Something like that would be a positive step. Honduras and El Salvador have statutes in their penal code related to hate-based crimes. Guatemala doesn't have that at this point. So there are sort of differences in terms of both law and also implementation. And so I think that there's something to learn from each of these cases. In each of the countries, of the three countries, there have been efforts to put in place specialized units to address both sexual and gender-based violence and also violence against children. So police units, prosecutors' offices, and also courts. So that's something where efforts are being made in all three countries. In each case, these have limited geographical scope and aren't accessible to all victims. They have limited personnel. They have limited capacity and equipment, for example, to investigate cases. So those are all steps in the right direction, but can be seen in some cases almost as pilot programs because of their lack of reach at this point, and they really need more support. In terms of assistance to victims, comprehensive assistance, for example, Ciudad Mujer is City of Women, or City for Women, is a model in El Salvador, started in El Salvador for a sort of one-stop victims assistance for victims of sexual and gender-based violence, among other things, where women can receive legal, medical, mental health assistance in one place. And that's recently been expanded to Honduras. There are other models that are similar to that. These are all still extremely small and limited in terms of their reach, but they are good examples of programming that can be improved and expanded.
Ms. Feasley, I appreciated you bringing up the example of that young girl in Honduras, because sometimes I think on a lot of these issues, we can get immersed in the details and the statistics, and we lose our human ability to feel that what the real impact is on people. And I think and I know I speak for everybody on this panel here. When you go to these countries and you actually talk to the people who have become victims, have been targeted, for a variety of reasons. It really, it's heartbreaking, and I'm, again, I'm just wondering, this issue of internally displaced people that you cited, it's huge. I mean, this is not a couple hundred people. It's the magnitude of this is more than I think most members of Congress have any clue. And the solution is going to have to be a big one. And maybe you might want to comment on, like, what more could we be doing here to encourage some sensible policies, to deal with that population. I mean, again, these are not people who are here in the United States. What we could do for them is not terminate TPS and not terminate DACA, but for those who are internally displaced in countries like Honduras or El Salvador, what more could we be doing?
So the issue of internal displacement is a very large issue for Central America. In El Salvador, the level of internal displacement has risen so much in the last few years that it actually has become the most high per capita country in the world, actually right along with Afghanistan and Syria. And I would say an important piece of this, first, is acknowledgement by the government. In the case of El Salvador, the wide range of numbers that I gave is because there's some issue as to whether the Salvadoran government will acknowledge those who have been displaced due to generalized violence in communities, if it's not a direct act of the government or other recognized actors. And so we have a large number, I think, that are hidden in many ways, which compounds the problem. An important factor, I think, here is making the connection between internal displacement and larger irregular migration. on the ground, we've heard from our partners that people frequently are displaced 2 to 3 times in their home country, and then normally around that 3rd or 4th time look to migrate outside of the country and leave the actual borders. And so we've seen in, you know, some of the experiences we've had exactly that pattern of individuals who do look to seek to stay in their community, but are forced because of different circumstances. I think Honduras has taken a first step of acknowledging the issue formally and coming to the table with UNHCR. But I would say acknowledgement by the government is an important factor. Also, the ability to have meaningful education and work opportunities in communities, and acknowledgement by the countries of controlled neighborhoods and territories, which effectively make people unable to move forward in their daily life. In the story of Maria, this was a family who was established in that community. It may not have been the safest community, but they had a routine, and the father had employment. With that initial displacement, the family then faced several other episodes of displacement that basically eradicated the financial livelihood of the family. Acknowledgement of gang control would also be an important piece here, I think, when we talk about transparency and the need for further programming and funding. Acknowledgement of what sorts of programs are kind of going into what communities. Another piece I would say, we work with Catholic Relief Services to work on youth builders programs, which are gang prevention programs that actually work within the gang controlled communities with consent from the local community. It's a program that I think it gives a way out for certain individuals who may otherwise be targeted. These are the type of specific programming, but obviously without acknowledgement from the government, you know, that's the vital first step.
So we have to vacate this room shortly, but I just want to end with one question for everybody here. So I was around as an aide in the 1980s, and I think much of U.S. policy toward the countries that we're talking about in the 1980s, I think most people can look back and say we're misguided, and that's a nice word to characterize them. But I think a lot of our policy put human rights issues in the background and not in the forefront. And I think a lot of those policies have, established, kind of trends that we're now dealing with now that are really serious. I mean, like I said, the idea that more people are dying now in some of these countries than when they were at war is just an astounding, statistic. We're always in the commission trying to figure out concrete things that we can do, policies that we can get behind, initiatives that we can undertake, that would have a positive impact, would be helpful. And so I'll go down the line here and just ask you, what more should the Congress be doing in addition to funding the U.S. strategy for engagement? There's a lot more we can do than just that, and if you have any ideas, I'd like to hear them now, and if you think of anything when you leave here, you can email us or call us, but I'd like to put it to everybody in the panel. I don't know who wants to go first, but Ms. Beltran?
Thank you for that. I think, first and foremost, I think the strengthening of the rule of law and protection of human rights need to be at the centerpiece of U.S. engagement with the region to address the issues that, as were mentioned, that date back, decades.
And let me just ask, is our embassies, the human rights offices, are they doing all that they should be doing right now? Are our embassies, with regard to any of these human rights issues, are they responding? We all have human rights officers there. Are they showing up to these trials? Are they meeting with the victims? Are they going to the areas that have been negatively impacted by, by security forces or by criminal gangs? Is our presence there, doing what they're supposed to be doing?
I can answer. I think it varies by country.
Yeah.
I think going back, and I'll return to that question. I think both financially but also politically, it's important that the U.S. and Congress continue to support efforts that are making a difference. The case of CSIC, which right now is under attack, I think, as Carlos rightly pointed out, we have election of attorney generals coming up in both Guatemala and Honduras, which are vital to the success of these efforts. There are election of magistrates of the Supreme Court. In Guatemala in 2019, magistrates, election of magistrates in El Salvador next year. These are all elections that, you know, don't necessarily require financial support, but require our attention. I think messages and bipartisan messages of how vital the rule of law and protection of human rights should, you know, are for the success of the strategy should continue. And more importantly, I think we need to press to ensure that there are indicators and metrics to measure the success of the strategy. It's not enough to say, you know, here's what we are investing in. You know, Lisa raised a good point about transparency, but I think we need to establish very clear metrics to ensure that we're investing strategically in the areas that need to be invested, to ensure that we measure the commitment on the part of the governments and the progress that is being made.
Well, with respect with the embassy, there are some efforts, and in some countries like Honduras, is the only source sometimes for support. Some of the members of the embassy has been working with LGBTI groups and some of the groups. Part of the investigation of Berta Caceres, the part of the investigation that have been working has been because of the U.S. support. The changes in terms of the attorney generals in Guatemala has been U.S. investment. But as Adriana said, we need to have a close monitoring about the investment. We have to monitor also the percentage of the funds they're gonna go in country and not gonna end in other places, and how we can also support the things that have been working. Thanks to the U.S. and thanks to international pressure and the organizations in Honduras, MASI has been operating and remains operating in Honduras. CICIG is operating in Guatemala because of international pressure for the CICIG to operate. So there are some things that we can do, and the diplomacy can be a source of supporting each one of these countries.
So good.
Focus very clearly on a few issues of human rights, extrajudicial executions in El Salvador right now, and just be persistent about that. In Honduras, the way the protesters, civil society are getting beaten up by state security forces, the involvement of state security in surveillance and in attacks against human rights defenders of all descriptions. The embassy is not doing the best job it could on that in Honduras. Focus there would be important. And then in Guatemala, the question of CICIG.
Dotson? Speak it to the mic so they could, yeah.
So we would emphasize what everyone on the panel has discussed in terms of the importance of judicial reform and strengthening in order to combat high levels of impunity and ensure access to justice and protection. But at the same time, our partners in the region have emphasized over and over again to us that there is really a lack of focus on prevention of violence, and that really needs to be a priority. In the case of sexual and gender-based violence, what that looks like is programming for youth, for schools, for families, in order to change some of the social norms underlying violence against women and girls and LGBTI people, opportunities for youth, educational opportunities, work opportunities. So really to look at violence from a prevention perspective as well.
Susan?
So the first I would say is to recognize the interconnectedness. You know, you mentioned temporary protected status, but really what happens here does affect the region. Many of your colleagues are not as informed as you on temporary protected status, the large size of the population that's at hand, and what exactly could happen. And so, I mean, I urge kind of understanding as to what something like this would do to the stability of the region, and also hope engagement with the administration and possibly a congressional solution if need be. The other piece I would say is continued assistance and monitoring of government systems is needed. Obviously funding and encouragement of civil society, but engagement of groups that have technical expertise, and I'm speaking particularly about the child welfare system and the migration return system,
Right.
Engaging those partners and effectively looking at these prevention strategies, but also coming at this not from just a security angle, but for a well-being and kind of continued growth within the country for prosperity.
Well, I appreciate it. I agree with you. We were trying very hard to give everybody a refresher course on TPS, so they're aware of it. And you know, and I've noticed some of my colleagues have suggested, well, these are supposed to be temporary programs, so why? Well, it has been evoked and it has been ended for a number of groups over the years, but the temporary nature of it was basically because we thought that that there'd be a short period where people would need protection. If the period is longer, then we need to readjust our approach. I mean, there's no deadline on TPS, but I mean, as I said before, based on the merits of what is happening, based on the merits of the program, what's happening in these countries, TPS is absolutely should be expanded. I wish more of my friends in the press would be focused on this issue. I'm glad they focused on the issue of DACA and the Dreamers, but this can just hit us, and we may have an announcement any day. So I agree, and we're trying very hard to raise awareness. But I'll just close by saying I appreciate everybody being here. Look, my frustration kind of with my government is that I don't really feel like we have a holistic, comprehensive approach to dealing with all the many issues that have been outlined here today. We have some ideas on some of these issues on how to respond, but it's to me it's not adequate. And I know we have a lot of crises all around the world, but there's a crisis going on in Central America, and if we don't start paying more attention and investing more resources and supporting some of the solutions that you all proposed here today, that crisis is going to get worse. And I would hate to see that happen, because the people of Central America have suffered enough. They deserve a better future. And so anyway, I thank you for being here, and the hearing is ended. Thank you.